Is there one true church, and is our job to find it and submit to it, no matter what its traditions and how it might impact our spiritual health? Or are there a bunch of different expressions of the church? And is it appropriate to ask which one is going to help me and my household thrive the best, given who we are, given what season we're in? How do we deal with this issue? So, my name is Jeremy. I'm a part of 1,000 Houses, where we activate households to disciple the city. And this has been a very difficult question for people to answer. And I think that Jesus actually gives us a compelling way to just frame this whole issue. And I wish so many more people, when they approach this question, would really dive into this. So, we're not going to do a deep dive on ecclesiology. I did stir up to, like, is there one true church? But I think one of the reasons why I'm a Protestant, I don't believe that only one expression of the church is the only legitimate expression, is partially because of what Jesus says here, what he envisions and what he does when he's confronted with these different traditions. And the way that he does this is he tells this really interesting parable about wineskins. But what I want you guys to see is that we have within Matthew, Mark, and Luke three different versions of this story, and they're all very similar. They all are very compatible, but they end slightly differently. Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us different nuances. And if you put these together, you get an incredibly helpful framework for how to understand how to deal with this question. So let's dive in. We have to start by really understanding what's going on in these passages. So the first one we're going to look at is Matthew 9:14 through 17. And what happens here, it says, Then the disciples of John came to him saying, this is Jesus, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus asked them, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskin, and so both are preserved. Okay, so just to frame up the story, John the Baptist's disciples are coming to Jesus. Now, Jesus was much harsher when the Pharisees asked questions like this about traditions, but I think he was a lot softer with the disciples of John the Baptist. And they're like, look, it's a season of fasting. We fast, the Pharisees are fasting. We've been hanging out with your disciples. They're not fasting. What's going on? Why aren't you participating in these traditions? And Jesus tells them the story about this unshrunk cloth, bridegroom, unshrunk cloth, and then ultimately wineskins. Now, what's really interesting about this particular account in Matthew, he ends by saying, but new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved. The story is that if you put this new wine into old wineskins, it'll both destroy the old wineskin and it will spill the new wine. What he seems to be saying here is that his disciples are like new wine. He's starting something new, something different. And so this tradition, this particular fasting tradition that Jesus is not saying anything against, he's calling that an old wineskin. He's saying what you guys are doing and participating in is an old wineskin. The problem is I have new wine. And the thing that Matthew is really keen to emphasize is the preservation of both. I think that one of the things that Matthew was very keen on is to preserve the understanding that part of the reason why new wine needs to go in a new wineskin is not just for the sake of the wine, but also for the sake of the old wineskin. You don't want to burst that old wineskin. Okay, so that was the emphasis of Matthew 9. Then we go to Mark 2, and you have a similar story, but it ends a little bit differently. He says, and no one puts new wine into old wineskins. This is Mark 2, around 21, 22. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. Okay, so the emphasis here is that the new wine needs to be put into fresh wineskins. And so he's a little bit more focused on how do we do what is in the best interest of the new wine. That's really what he's describing here. That new wine is for new wineskins. Okay, so your particular traditions that you're participating in is not designed for the new wine. What we need is fresh new wineskins for the new wine. Now, that's a lot of clarity, I think. But then he says something in Luke 5. This is, again, the same story, the disciples of John, same parables, but it ends a little bit differently. So he says, "But the new wine," this is Luke 5, "must be put into fresh wineskins." Then he adds this, "And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says the old is good." Wow. Okay. That's a really interesting nuance to add to this discussion. He says that if you've ever experienced old wine, if you have the capacity to appreciate old wine, you're going to enjoy that better. And he really is suggesting that there is something qualitatively better about old wine. Does this contradict what he's been saying earlier in this passage or what he says in Matthew, what he says in Mark? I think the framework is the important question when deciding on a wineskin is the type of wine. If it's new, it's going to want new wineskin. If it's old, it's going to want old wineskin. And if it has a capacity to appreciate old wine, then the older the tradition, these ancient traditions are actually in some ways better because as a matter of taste, you're going to enjoy it more. There's something deeper. And this is very true, of course, about wine. I mean, so the fact that he's talking about this, he's saying anybody who understands how wine works, it really is a connoisseur of wine. You tend to appreciate old wine more than new wine. All right, there's a lot here, I think, that really helps answer. I think one of the most divisive and most kind of confusing questions that people ask about, okay, how do I pick a church tradition for my family and in this season? And this really makes sense of something that I've seen my whole life that has been deeply confusing to me. So oftentimes I'll hear from people, particularly in, very, I would say like seeker friendly or very progressive in terms of traditions, new wineskins, churches that are like very much like trying to be hyper relevant. If you are ever a part of those churches, one of the things you'll discover very quickly is some of the people who are the most committed and most excited about that church grew up in old traditions, like a Catholic family or an Orthodox family, and there was something about those traditions that was not connecting with them. They found them very lifeless. And then maybe they went off to a young life camp or some kind of experience, and they heard and experienced the gospel in some powerful way. And they really often want nothing to do with that old wineskin because they feel like it got in the way of their faith. What they start to look for is a new wineskin, and once they find it, they're just like their faith erupts. If you've ever seen this experience, this is so repeatable, such a common experience, and it's very difficult to say, "Oh, you know what would have been way better is if they didn't go to that camp, they never found that church tradition." What they needed to do was just stay in that old wineskin, and even if it completely did not connect with them and they never felt at home there or they ever found God, the most important thing is that they stay in the old wineskin. A lot of people believe that. I don't believe that. I think that's a really important thing that they needed to discover the gospel. It doesn't say that that old wineskin was ultimately at fault. This was new wine and it did need new wineskin. So why can't we celebrate the fact that these people who are coming out of an old wineskin that to them was lifeless because they were new wine needed a new wineskin? Now, the other part of the story is oftentimes you'll find somebody who grew up in one of these maybe evangelical churches that's like really trying to be relevant and they've got the fog machine and they've got the cool band. And as somebody grows up and they go deeper and deeper and deeper into their faith, they start to find this tradition that they're a part of very lifeless. And then all of a sudden they'll stumble upon an ancient tradition. That might be a Catholic mass, an Orthodox liturgy, or even sort of Toraic rhythms in the Bible. And it'll be like water in a desert. They are so satiated and so inspired by these ancient traditions. And they just come alive and they talk about it like it's the best thing in the world. And they convert to Catholicism or convert to Orthodoxy, or they start to practice all these traditions. And to them, it's so rich and real. And oftentimes what's kind of interesting to watch is the ships passing in the night, because if you ever talk to an ex-Catholic who found a new wineskin and their whole faith erupted, talking to Somebody who's been in the evangelical world for 10, 20, 30 years is very mature in their faith, but is so inspired by these ancient traditions that they have a hard time even talking to each other. And this is really what I think Jesus is getting at with the bursting of the wineskins. If you force new wine into old wineskins or old wine into new wineskins, something fundamentally bad happens. And that's the reason why we need both. But if you hear people talk about, man, I just the old is better, the old is better, the old is better. It's really important to be careful and say, on one hand, yes, Jesus is affirming that. No one who's ever had the ability to distinguish between new wine and old wine would prefer the new wine. They're gonna prefer the old wine. But he says over and over again, there are people who are new wine and they need these new wineskins. And that's, of course, what he's actually emphasizing in both in Matthew and the Mark, and I think also in the Luke account. He's trying to give an answer to John's disciples and explain to them, this is the reason why I am not joining your traditions. I affirm that they're good, they're ancient, they're beautiful. And I think that Jesus is even saying he personally prefers them. However, he is right now focused on new wine, and therefore he understands the importance of having new wineskins. So, what do we do with this? Well, I think that we have to be really careful, you guys, about having a one size fits all perspective. And this is, again, why I'm a Protestant. I wish so badly, and I've told all my friends who are Catholic and Orthodox, I would love to sit and participate and enjoy the old wine with them. One of the problems I have with doing that is because they believe they're the one true church. Once I convert into their tradition, if new wine starts to emerge in my family or in those I disciple, I am forced to push them into an old wineskin, even if it's not what is best for their faith. I will feel that pressure because I will have made the declaration that this is the one true church and everybody should be a part of it. This is the one true Eucharist or whatever. So once you make those kinds of statements that only old wine is legitimate and only old wineskins are from the Lord and are the one true church, then of course you run into this real dilemma that Jesus is trying to resolve here. However, if you just accept everything Jesus is saying here, and again, we're not getting super deep into ecclesiology. I know there's 100 other verses that come in when people are like, "What about this authority?" And I know there's a million things we could talk about. I just want to say, from a framework perspective, it's really important to understand that for those of us who do not believe that there is one true church, but there's lots of different expressions of the church that are legitimate, I read this passage about the difference in wineskins, and it's extremely instructive and helpful to me because I really can understand why, as a father or a leader of a family, I am going to be watching my own children, those who I disciple, and understand that there are some folks who are raised in a way where they can really truly appreciate the old wine, even at a young stage in their life or a young stage in their spiritual maturity. They're able to really savor the old wine. But there are so many people who can't. And to take away from them the experience, or those who are exceptionally gifted at crafting new wineskins, and to say that, look, all that's illegitimate. And I would rather, because the old wine is so much better to me, I would rather that new wine gets spilled out on the ground than acknowledge that there's anything but old wineskins. That is what I hear from people who are like, look, there's only one true church. And I'm sorry that, there are millions of people who have grown up in it and are not experiencing the gospel in any meaningful way. And I've seen millions of those people come into a dynamic relationship with the Lord through new wineskins. But if I could, theologically, I would cut off every one of those new wineskins and only force all that new wine into old wineskins. That is a lose lose according to Jesus. You both will hurt the old wineskin because if you force, and this is what we saw over and over again in the Middle Ages and a lot of these different difficult times in church history, people were just being forced into this same wineskin. I've just been studying the Puritan movement, a lot of things that were happening in England, and just these new wineskins they kept trying to build, and people kept getting thrown in prison and burned at the stake. And it's just like, why attack the wineskins? Why not let the different wineskins develop so that there's places for new wine and there is an appreciation for old wine without it suggesting that there's only one answer. So thanks for jumping in here. We would love to talk to you guys. Go to onecage.org if you're interested. We have a deep dive into our own ecclesiology, our understanding of how the church works, and all of its diversity, and how this impacts households that we're activating to disciple the city. We have a great course called A House for Community, where we dive into, okay, what does it mean for us to craft the kinds of communities in and through our houses that are full of life, that allow us to practice radical hospitality for those who are being discipled and coming to the kingdom, and something that's fully integrated with our children and our family as a whole. So that is a wineskin expression that we think is missing in a lot of people's lives and that they are really hungry for. So we'd love to talk to you guys about that if you're interested. But yeah, let me know in the comments if there are elements to this that you'd push back on. Again, this is not an exhaustive ecclesiology at all. I just think that this is the key analogy for understanding why it's important to embrace the fact that there are such different traditions in the church, and that this is why I think that's ultimately a good thing.